Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm very pleased to participate in this important debate today, and I want to extend my warm thanks to the Honourable Member for Strangford for bringing this debate forward. He set out a comprehensive and convincing case on the horror, as did others, on the horror of the forced live organ donation that takes place in China. We've heard from several members today about the allegations of forced live organ extraction from prisoners in that country. And we've been hearing of, for at least the last decade, about the alleged victims being members of religious and ethnic minorities. Forced organ removal is when people are killed for the organ to be removed, with the recipients apparently being wealthy Chinese people or transplant tourists who travel to China and pay substantial sums to receive the transplant. The waiting times for such transplants are short, and it seems vital organs can even be booked in advance. As the Honourable Member for Strangford pointed out, the China Tribunal, which has investigated this, has issued an interim judgment stating that it is sure, beyond reasonable doubt, that in China, forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience has been practised for a substantial period of time, involving a very substantial number of victims. And we also heard that from the Honourable Member for Congleton and the Honourable Member for Manchester Gorton. This is absolutely horrific and is an affront to all that is decent, and quite frankly is something that one would expect to read about in a science fiction novel. We know that during around 2006, a report was published giving credence to the claims that the Chinese authorities were indeed removing organs from executed members of the Falun Gong. At that time, the Chinese authorities acknowledged that organs had been taken from executed prisoners, but only with their consent. But certainly the European Parliament disputed China's official version of events and passed a motion condemning the state sanctioning of organ removal from non-consenting prisoners of conscience, including from large numbers of Falun Gong practitioners who were imprisoned for their religious beliefs. But the figures for transplants are somewhere, as we've heard, although we'll probably never know the true figure, but they're somewhere between 40,000 and 90,000 transplants, as the Honourable Member for Strangford set out. I will take a point from the Honourable Lady.
Thanks. Thank my honourable friend very much. I didn't know that she had heard me. But given that that first report was in 2006, does she agree with me that we're now 13 years overdue in the UK in calling for intergovernmental investigation into Chinese practices?
The Honourable Lady is absolutely right, and she tempts me to skip to that part of my remarks, but I will get to her remarks in due course. But her point, I think, is very well made and has been made several times, I think, round the chamber today. This barbaric, inhumane practice must end, and the international community, as the Honourable Lady from Glasgow, I want to say Glasgow North East, but I don't think it is, Glasgow North West, as the Honourable Lady from Glasgow North West, the international community, including the UK, I would hope, led by the UK, but I'll settle for including the UK, must leave China in no doubt how repugnant this practice is to any country that has any sense of decency or places any value on the dignity of human life. There can be no equivocation, there can be no excuses, and there can be no turning of blind eyes. As the Honourable Member for Strangford has pointed out, it is treating people like cattle. And he gave us a very comprehensive account of how utterly unspeakable this practice is, and the bizarre situation that we find ourselves in, where the World Health Organization has declared organ transplants in China as ethical and raises no cause for suspicion. And I would urge the Minister, as others have today, to query and pursue this as a matter of urgency, since it seems to fly in the face of a considerable amount of evidence about which we know from the China Tribunal, Jeffrey Nice QC and others. And a number of members today have expressed alarm at this assessment from the World Health Organization. Such a ruling, I think, undermines the organisation itself. To date, as we have heard from the Honourable Member for Congleton, Italy, Spain, Israel and Taiwan have introduced laws banning their citizens from participating in organ tourism, with Canada working towards adopting similar legislation. Perhaps the Minister, as others have asked him today, perhaps the Minister can tell us what plans are in place to bring in similar legislation in the UK. Now, given that the UK has signed the Council of Europe Convention against Trafficking in Human Organs, forbidding the intentional removal of human organs from living or deceased donors, for the UK to forbid its citizens from engaging in organ tourism is quite a small leap from that. So perhaps the Minister can explain what his government is doing in the UK to take that small but extremely important leap. As the Honourable Lady for Congleton has informed us, the UK government and the UN must do more about what can only be categorised as crimes against humanity and the vast industrial scale of this horror. Indeed, the fact that the Falun Gong practitioners are targeted in this way in China goes to the heart of the matter, as the Honourable Member for Strangford has articulated, because an attack on freedom of religion is an attack on all freedoms. The right of all people to worship their God in peace, however they perceive their God, is a fundamental right which, if threatened, threatens the very basis of freedom in the widest sense of how we understand it, as the Honourable Member for Manchester Gorton also pointed out. The All-Party Group for International Freedom of Religion or Belief produced a report from June last year which found a signal lack of understanding and misperception of religion and belief among decision-makers working within the UK asylum system. And we need to better understand religious persecution and deal with it in an appropriately sensitive way, and ensure that decision-makers in the UK asylum system have the appropriate training to make sure they make the correct decisions, which are literally a matter of life and death to applicants seeking asylum. There is no doubt that China exerts absolute and cruel control over its citizens, about which the international community is and ought to be exercised. The targeting of multiple faiths and ethnic groups have been characterised by some as being the hallmarks of genocidal intent. As the Honourable Member for Burton, who is no longer in his place, indicated, there are echoes here, loud echoes from the evils of history. The UK government needs to step up to its international responsibilities and its moral responsibilities, as does indeed the international community. No one should or could read the evidence or hear the stories of forced live organ extraction and be unmoved by it, or not be horrified by it. It is an outrage, and we must not be afraid to say so and put as much pressure on China as international institutions and governments around the globe can possibly bring to bear. That is our duty, and it is what decency demands of us. If any nation treats any of its people in such a cruel and despicable way, we need to stand with other free and democratic states and condemn this in the harshest and most unequivocal language we can articulate. And I look forward to the Minister telling us what influence and pressure his government has been and will continue to exert on China in light of this debate today. And I also ask what the UK government will do to encourage greater action on this barbarism from the international community. There is no doubt either that China is an important and influential international player, but no state should be allowed to engage in such horrific human rights abuses simply because it is influential. We have an international duty to uphold human rights and values as and how we can. We can do more to effect change, and it's time for the international community to do so, and the UK must play its part in that.